tell me when it's safe to erase that, folks. Is it okay to start taking that apart from the top down? All right. Okay, well, we kind of finished our chemical foundation, so let's actually start looking at some of the properties and functions and roles of these different biological polymers, the major molecules of life. We're going to start out with sugars and polysaccharides. We'll probably just get sugars today. Okay, now the term polysaccharides means many sugars because of course that's indeed what they're made of. The edible versions, not all of them are edible or digestible, are often called carbohydrates. That's chemically not an appropriate chemical term, but you find that talking about diet and things like that. So carbohydrates are polysaccharides that we can digest and use as an energy source. And that includes things like starch and what we may call glycogen and stuff like that. But not all polysaccharides are edible, at least to us. Okay, now, polysaccharides are made of sugars. And what is a sugar? Now, before we start here, I want to give a little warning here. I'm going to draw a lot of chemical structures on the board, okay? You're not responsible for detailed chemical structures unless, and there will be one particular example that will specifically say so. I'm drawing these structures to give you folks an idea of how the molecules are put together. Of course, you got the same illustrations in the text and things like that. But I'm putting those structures down just to show you features of the molecule, how they're put together and stuff. I'm not going to draw, the sugar fructose or something like that. That ain't going to happen. I may ask, I'll ask more general questions like a triglyceride is made of a glycerol molecule with 3 fatty acids. Even if I draw a detailed structure of a triglyceride, you don't have to worry about it. So fair warning here. Now if you take biochemistry, is anybody taking biochem here? Okay, you did have to know all the detailed gory structures, right? All right. Okay, usually people take biochem after this. A lot of students have told me that this is really good training. This is really good background for first semester biochem. So you probably know most of this kind of stuff. But anyway, so bear with us. Okay, so even though I draw structures on the board, we're not going to be held responsible for detailed structures. There's one exception, and I will do that much. That's much later. Okay, what is a sugar? Okay, sugars are polar ring-shaped molecules with a carbon ring close by a covalent bond to an oxygen atom. And sugars are basically made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now there are some modified sugars that have nitrogen-containing groups as well. We'll see those in a little bit. But your typical sugar is a ring-shaped molecule. Most sugars have 6 carbons. Many have 5. There are some 4-carbon sugars around, which we won't really mention. There's even some 7 or 8-carbon sugars. But those are relatively minor sugars, minor components of things. So we're not going to deal with them. We're going to focus on the 5 and 6-carbon sugars. So let's make a sugar. We're going to have carbon. This will be a 6-carbon sugar. Okay, we have single covalent bonds from one carbon to the next, and an oxygen closing that ring, and then a covalent bond out to this carbon. Now, coming off the carbons are going to be a combination of hydrogens and OH or hydroxyl groups. And the orientation of the different OH and hydrogens determines what kind of sugar you've got. Okay, so that's a typical 6-carbon sugar. I don't know what it is, by the way, but okay. It's a typical 6-carbon sugar. Now, sugar molecules are going to be very polar because all these polar hydroxyl groups. So they're very polar molecules. Think of this. How much sugar can you dissolve in water? You can take your ordinary table sugar and dissolve about 70–75% by weight in water to make a thick, goopy syrup. And of course you can go and buy that stuff at Winn-Dixie. Corn syrup, pancake syrup, maple syrup if you got a lot of money, that kind of stuff. So, concentrate solutions, sugars. So sugars are extremely soluble in water because they're extremely polar molecules. Not surprisingly, polysaccharides are also polar. So we've got these 6 carbon sugars we have, and we often do a shorthand representation of a sugar, which is like so, with each corner or vertex representing a carbon. So this would be, and you forget about the hydrogens and the OH groups and stuff. So that's a representation of a 6 carbon sugar. Now 5 carbon sugars are shaped kind of like a pentagon. Here we go. There we go. That's a 5 carbon sugar. And we use the shorthand notation quite a bit. Okay, now there are also some sugars. Your typical sugars have nothing more than carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms. But there are some sugars that have nitrogen-containing groups, like so. And so with nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. Now this is what we call an amino group. And because nitrogen is more electronegative than hydrogen, amino groups are polar. And we call these kinds of modified sugars amino sugars. So there are certain types of amino sugars around as well. Most of the sugars that we're familiar with are ordinary sugars. But amino sugars are important in many different types of polysaccharides. And we'll see that somewhat later on. All right. Now, taking a look at some common kinds of sugars. Let's take a look at a few of our common 6 carbon sugars and a few of our common 5 carbon sugars and what they do. Now, it turns out sugars are very important energy sources for cells and organisms because metabolizing sugars, especially if you can break them down completely to carbon dioxide and water, release a great deal of metabolic energy. As a matter of fact, sugars can be show you that reactions of sugars with oxygen are quite exergotic. You can make a nice mix and this has occasionally happened where places like sugar factories have blown up because a lot of fine sugar dust gets into the air, ignites, and you get a catastrophic explosion that's powerful enough to kill people and destroy entire buildings. So sugars, especially when they're finely powdered, sugars ignite and burn quite nicely, and they release a great deal of energy. So when we do a metabolic reactions on them, you can get quite a bit of energy out of them. And the most important 6 carbon sugar, and the one that's used as the predominant energy source for most organisms, is the one called glucose. Now glucose is produced by plants during photosynthesis. Enzymes can convert the glucose into polysaccharides or into other types of 6 carbon sugars. And enzymes can turn other 6 carbon sugars back into glucose. So organisms have these interconversion enzymes that can flip one 6 carbon sugar into another. Okay, so glucose is the sugar formed from carbon dioxide during the process of photosynthesis, both in plants and in cyano or blue-green bacteria. Okay, now, it's often called commercially, you'll see the term dextrose, that's a commercial name for it, or sometimes called corn sugar, that's another term for it. Oh, okay, so if you see an ingredient label, something like corn sugar or dextrose, they're just referring to garden variety glucose. And organisms we have, for instance, certain amounts of glucose in our bloodstream that provide a ready supply of energy that cells can take up. Too little glucose, and you start doing things like going into comas and stuff like that. Too much can actually cause cellular and organ damage. And of course, that's controlled by the hormone insulin, which regulates the uptake of glucose and to some extent the release of glucose into the bloodstream. People who are diabetic Either they don't produce enough insulin or don't produce any at all in some cases, or the cells don't respond properly to insulin. That's what they call a type 2 diabetes. We make enough insulin, but the cells aren't responding properly to it. Okay, so that's a big kind of thing. So we keep glucose levels in our bloodstream within a fairly narrow range, at least if you're not diabetic. If you are, then you have to control your diet and take insulin injections periodically and so on. Okay, so that's glucose. And once again, it's a major energy source for cells and for most organisms. Okay, now, there are other kinds of 6-carbon sugars. Another common one is known as fructose, often called fruit sugar because fruits are loaded up with it. Fructose is about twice as sweet as glucose, so that's one reason why it's sometimes used as a flavoring ingredient. Tastes a lot sweeter. So it's metabolized somewhat differently, so there's a big controversy about excess use of fructose. For instance, how many people, you look at the ingredient list on a lot of the sodas and drinks you folks have, a lot of times they'll say, like the big Coke there, they'll say high, grab it, take a look at it. What does it say? What's probably the first ingredient, the second ingredient after water?
Diet.
Aspartame, phosphoric acid.
Oh, all right, you diet stuff. I didn't realize that. Okay, well, a lot of times for the real thing, you need diet stuff? Jeez, you don't look it. Okay, well, that's the last thing you'd want.
Taste.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, a lot of these things have what they call high fructose corn syrup. In corn syrup, for instance, it comes from the kernels of corn, is almost pure glucose. Now, how do you get high fructose corn syrup? That's an example of conversion of one 6-carbon sugar to another. What people do, what these big food companies do, is they take literally railway cars full of corn syrup, glucose, and of course corn growth is heavily subsidized by the federal government. States in the Midwest, the center is always pushing for that. So you grow lots of corn. What do you do with this corn? Okay, well, you take a lot of these animal feed, people feed, export it, turn it into ethanol, ferment it into ethanol. But a lot of things what you do is you take the corn, grind it up, make the corn syrup, glucose. And then what they do is they throw in enzymes, crude enzymes from microbes like yeast and stuff. Converts about half the glucose into fructose, which is 4 times as sweet, so more bang for the buck. And of course, it's what these guys are looking for is the buck. And that's what we call high fructose corn syrup. Okay, there's going to be a debate about that because fructose is metabolized mostly in the liver. It doesn't seem to deal with the appetite control mechanism as well as glucose does. So there's a controversy about whether that stuff in large amounts might actually be harmful or have a tendency in and over the calorie content of leading to people getting overweight. A few companies now are already starting to see the writing on the wall and they're steering away from it. You can see some products that are advertised contains no high fructose corn syrup because of the controversy, which is still undecided about it. But some of these guys are thinking, well, if they do find harmful effects, we are going to get the what suit out of us. So we might as well quit while we're ahead, switch to slightly more expensive table sugar. Okay, so that's fructose. Now, another one that's commonly found is something called galactose. So these are 3 common. Galactose is produced in certain kinds of plants and stored. And these are 3 common. There are many other 6-carbon sugars. Now, when we go to 5-carbon sugars, once again, many kinds, but we'll look at a couple of the most important ones. The most important one is a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. Ribose is used in nucleotides. That's the sugar that we make nucleotides out of. Having a hydrogen instead of an OH group at one position in the molecule leads to the 5-carbon sugar called deoxyribose, literally missing an oxygen. It too is used in nucleotides. But these nucleotides containing deoxyribose are used as the building blocks of DNA. RNA is made from nucleotides containing ribose. So those are 2 common 5-carbon sugars. Now another one that's very important is something called ribulose. Ribulose is important because a ribulose with two phosphates covalently attached to it is the molecule that picks up and binds carbon dioxide from the air in the first step of turning carbon dioxide into glucose. In other words, ribulose is a starting material for what we call the dark reactions or Calvin cycle of photosynthesis, or at least a modified ribulose. Okay, so those are some common 5 and 6 carbon sugars. And this is probably a good point to stop. What we will do when we come back on Tuesday is we'll look at how sugars are covalently joined to each other, look at what we call disaccharides, combinations of 2 sugars, and then we'll start going into different kinds of polysaccharides. Okay, so I'll see you guys in lab.